Just a few things before we get started. So I'm excited to be here. I know there's a lot of you, we asked the question as you registered, sort of where you were at in the grant management process. If you, were new to this or if you've been doing this for a long time. And then we got such a wide response. So it was a little more difficult to tailor this to a specific group. So what I've tried to do here is sort of meet in the middle, right? So for some of you today will just be a review, and maybe you can do like a health checkup to see maybe some things that you could make changes to if necessary, or, oh gosh, I could probably do this instead of this. For a lot of you, this might be a little overwhelming if you haven't done anything because there's a lot of information, right? The good part is that you do have all the materials that you can look at later, and we're going to spend a little bit of time at the very end. There's several things on the reference slide that are really good for future reference. There's a few modules that are actually put together by one of the leading finance management for healthcare professors. He actually passed away in 2016, but I think his book was on the 6th edition when he passed away, and they actually went ahead and completed that text. So, I mean, clearly he's the expert. So there's a lot of information like that, and he has some training modules that are a pretty easy read. And so for some of that information, if you're looking for more than that, there'll be some ways to do other things outside of what we're doing today. We're going to try to break it up a little bit so you don't have to sit here and listen to me talk for hours on end. There's a couple of options that we have that we can do breakout rooms. So that's going to be fun for us to get to do a little hands-on activity. I promised that I wouldn't overburden everybody with math today, and the math that we will do, we will get to cheat and use Excel, and we'll save that till the end. So hopefully it will not burn everybody out in the process. And like Emily and Alexa said, if you have any questions or comments, we can always chat during a break or during your breakout rooms. And also if you need to just send it to them, and we'll get to that when we can. So let's sort of look at where we're going to go today. The introduction, that's where we're at right now. Part one is, what do managers do? I think it's always a good idea to stop and think, like, what are we supposed to be doing in the process of all of these things? In section 2, we're actually going to talk about documentation. It's so important, the documentation, and we can feel like that's busy work, and that's why do we have to do all this paperwork, all these things, but it's really important for us. So we're going to talk about why that's important and exactly what we should be documenting and how we can do that. And then we're going to get into the meat of today, which is managing project finances. And what do we mean by that? And what are the components of all of those things? So we're actually going to get through parts 1 and 2 relatively quickly because we want to spend the bulk of the day in part 3. But I just want to get us going, and so we can sort of come into that when we get to the managing the finances, why do these other things matter before we get to that kind of point. So we have some learning objectives. Of course, we'll have the conclusion. I always forget the conclusion. So learning objectives for today, at the end of the webinar, we should be able to do several things, right? The first, we want to identify the 3 overarching categories of resources that managers allocate, okay? So if we start to compartmentalize these things, we can make sure that we actually are including all the things that we need to include, and hopefully we're not missing something that's going to cause us an issue later. We're also going to identify the 5 reasons for documentation. As I just mentioned, documentation is really important, so we want to discuss at least 5 reasons why we would want to do so, and hopefully we can realize how important that documentation is. And then we want to talk about the 3 different categories to document. And we've got a bunch of handouts for you, so some of the stuff will be on the slides, but there's a lot of handouts that go with this for you to look back through later on and sort of see where you're at and do, like I said, a health checkup. We want to define the differences between what an in-kind contribution is, a direct cost, and an indirect cost. These can be kind of tricky, and they get people a little flustered sometimes. So we want to make sure everybody's on the page for what do we classify when we talk about in-kind contributions, direct costs, and indirect costs. And finally, we want to, or actually, one more thing after that, we want to identify the 5 components of a total project budget versus the grant proposal and the grant budget. So those are not the same things. So we want to highlight what actually goes in the total project budget versus what we're actually talking about as far as the grant money goes. Again, if you think they're the same thing, you're probably going to be in trouble sometime as far as budgeting goes. So we want to make sure that, and not all of you will have all those 5 components, but here's the things that would make that up. So we want to be sure everybody's clear on that. And finally, here's where we get to do some math. This is where we get to learn how to calculate a simple variance analysis, which I think will be very useful, even if you have no budget background. I know most of you probably, are not in this grant management because you went to school to do that, right? A lot of you care about the things that you care about in public health, and you have made your way into a situation where you're managing a grant. which is great. But it also means that most of us are not overly skilled in this. This is not our bread and butter per se, but it becomes our bread and butter because if we don't manage the grant well, we're in trouble for our program or project. So hopefully these little short tools will at least get us something to be able to do a health check on your actual budget throughout the year so that you don't get to the end of the year and have a major issue. So those are the things we hope to learn today. So let's go ahead then and get started. We're going to get, like I said, we're going to start with part one, and that's going to be just our basic, what do managers do? What do managers do? What does it even mean to manage, right? Some of you say that. It's funny, I know when I first talk about this with my students, you know, leadership and management, a lot of times people have those like they're synonymous, right? And the reality is they're not. And so as we went through it, I know that I have several students who have thought about it and said, gosh, I'm a really good manager, but I'm not a very good leader, or I'm a really good leader, but I'm not a very good manager. And for most of you, you're probably trying to do both. And so that makes it even more difficult when you try to tease those things out of what are we talking about when we do those kind of things. So first, the definition of management. Management means to allocate resources to accomplish things, okay? So allocating resources to accomplish things, pretty basic definition, right? But a big, huge chunk of what we're going to talk about today is actually allocating resources. What do managers actually do to allocate resources? And of course, we're accomplishing things. That's the whole goal of our project or program. So we want to just think about that a little bit, about management. So we're allocating resources. So if we're talking about leadership, right? Leadership is more of a vision thing, right? If you're looking at that overarching, where are we going to go? Where are we going to end up in 5 years? We want to, you know, fix the homeless situation in our communities. We want to make sure we're providing all these things that we need to do. That's that vision. And so a leader is able to do that. They provide vision and direction. But on the other hand, a manager is somebody who's overseeing those day-to-day tasks, right? You're checking to see if things are performed on time, if they're done correctly, if adjustments need to be made, because really we're thinking about like this. We need to put one foot in front of the other, right? A manager has to keep us on track, right? And so like a really good example of this is sort of a political one. Ronald Reagan was a huge leader. He was a visionary, right? He was like, dream big, let's have a defense program. We're gonna have Star Wars. How do we get there? No answer, okay? That just wasn't the thing. On the other hand, George H.W. Bush, who was his vice president and then became president, he used to always say, I don't get that vision thing. He just wasn't a leader in that way, right? He was really great with management, but he wasn't a very good leader. So of course, they made a nice little pair when they were president and vice president. It didn't work out so great when HW went to be in that leadership role because he was used to being much more of a manager. So we really just want to think about those and the differences between those. And as I mentioned, I realize that so many of you are working understaffed, underpaid, overworked, right? So you're probably playing both roles. I mean, that's more than likely that's the key. But what you need to do is when you're doing the management side, think about that. Are you working too far ahead? Do you need to sort of back up a little bit and think about what your job is today? What are you keeping track of this month? How are we going to get to that big picture at some point and doing the baby steps? So we just need to recognize that kind of stuff, because when you're allocating resources, even though you have to look in the big picture, like for a budget in a year's time, right, you're still going to have to figure out how to do that on a day-to-day basis and not have a problem when you get to the end. Okay. All right, so roles and responsibilities of managers. Of course, managers allocate resources. That's the big thing. Managers also have to have skills, and they also have to have responsibility and authority to do their job. Now, we're going to spend most of our time today talking about allocating resources. And for a lot of you, clearly you know that you need that responsibility and authority to do your job. But that also applies to the staff that you might have that are working for you. Are you giving them, are you assigning responsibility enough for them to know what their job actually is so that you can check to make sure they're doing it? And are you giving them the authority to carry that out? Do you have a set of responsibilities that you have to answer for, and do you have the authority to carry those out? If not, you know, that's a conversation you can have with others in the organization that you can make sure you're actually able to do the things that you're supposed to be doing. And of course, we all know that managers need skills because they have to be able to manage these resources and allocate time and check for things. And so a lot of us don't have the necessary skills. We didn't come in, like I said, we're not trained for this. But the beauty of skills is that they can be learned, right? So the whole goal, that's why most of you, I assume, are here today, is to pick up some of those skills, right? And there's always another training or something that you can go if you're missing pieces, and we're so lucky that we have the internet as a resource to be able to pull off a bunch of different things. So, if you're having problems with one issue, you can probably Google really quickly and find some information that will help you get those skills. So like I said, we're not going to spend a lot of time on those two pieces today, just a reminder that we have to have those as well. The big one for us is really that the managers have to allocate resources. So if our main goal is to talk about allocating resources, what are the resources that a manager allocates, right? Because resources, well, what is that? Well, there's three overarching resources that managers allocate, and those are time, money, and things. Time, money, and things. Now, you guys have a handout actually called resource allocation. Let's see. Oops. That looks like this. And if we look at that, notice there are several pieces. So time, money, and things are the overarching pieces of this resource allocation. But if you notice, there are several different pieces here in each one of these. And so, it's probably a good idea for you after we finish to stop and think about which of these things are you managing, right? Is there more that you need to include? You'll notice from most of our handouts today that they're really basic, right? This is just let's do a check. You may need to mark some things off. You might need to add some things to this, right? But the whole goal here is just to get you thinking about, okay, and then when you look at these resources of time, money, and things, where are you spending the most amount of your time as a manager, right? Is there a way, do you need to be spending more time on one of these areas than another? Are the volunteers taking up too much of your time? Do you need to give that responsibility to someone else? Do you need to create a volunteer leader to be able to do those kind of things, right? Where are you spending the majority of your management time on managing these time, money, and things? So again, I think it's just a good idea for us to think about that, how much of our day, and I think we all just get so busy, we show up and we do what we have to do right this minute, and we don't really think about how much of that is eating up our management time. And are we doing that in the best and most efficient and effective way we possibly can? So hopefully that will be helpful to you later. Time, money, and things. That's the three resources that managers allocate. And a really good way for us to look at this is to talk about organizational charts, right? Everybody's favorite, the org chart. Okay, now the reason I bring that up is this. For most of you, if you're working on a project or program, and basically I'm going to use those words as the same thing today. Sometimes I'll say both, sometimes I'll say one or the other, but I know most of you are, if you're managing a grant, it's probably for a program or for a specific project, right? So we got a little bit of both of those things. But a lot of you are actually then under the umbrella of an organization to manage that program or project, right? Maybe you're a piece of a health department, so you're part of the overall organization. So when we think about that, we know that most of those have an organizational chart. As a matter of fact, I have one here. This is from the Missoula Health Department. And I think I have one, another one also in your packet that actually is the organizational chart for DPHHS. But it's actually not for the whole organization. I think that one's just for family and child care services. And the reason I picked that is because I wanted us to see that if you look at the health department as a whole, notice there's several components. Well, maybe you're over here in the DUI task force, right? So you're thinking, well, I'm part of this organizational chart, but do you have one actually for your DUI task force, right? So that's a really good way for you to put that into perspective, to see not only what your responsibilities are, but what anybody else who's working with you and where do they fit in that chart. And it's easier for us to then assign those responsibilities and keep track as the manager of who's doing what job. So, and I always have people say, well, these look so fancy. What do you do? How do you do that? So just really quickly, here's a blank one, right? This is just a smart art, okay? So you can download a template. There's lots of them out there that work for you, but you actually don't have to spend forever making these boxes. If you just go to insert either on Word or in PowerPoint and hit Smart Art, it gives you several different options depending on what your organization actually looks like. And then these text boxes, you actually are allowed to type in just the names that you need. So it can be relatively basic. You just need something to make sure that everybody understands where they're at in this hierarchy and who's going to be responsible to whom as you work through your program or project. All right, so see, we already railed through part one. That's good, we're good. So what is it that managers do? First of all, the biggest thing that I think that you'll see in any textbook that you read about grant management is to do what you say you're gonna do. Seems simple enough, right? But if you really want to check on what you're doing, right, especially if you're managing grants, you need to think about, what did you say you were going to do? What are the goals? What is your budget? What did you say you were going to do, and are you doing it? So if you do what you said you would do, you're going to be okay, right? Now, how it is that you do that, right? You managers allocate resources. Again, it's time, money, or what? Things, time, money, and things. And we can use an organizational chart, right? Because that's a useful resource and it can help keep everybody responsible for what they're supposed to be doing. But again, I can't stress enough that your job as a manager is to do what you said you would do, okay? I mean, that's what's going to happen. The grantor is going to be holding you to whatever it was that you said you were doing. So you want to make sure that when you're applying for the grant, that you're very specific and very clear about what it is that you are going to do so that you actually can do that. Some of you have just been given grants that you're now trying to manage. So it'd be a really good idea to go back to that grant, that award letter, and look in the budget narrative, look at the budget you've been given, and see what it was that whoever made the grant, whoever wrote the grant, what did they say that would be done, and make sure that you're doing that. Because I think that's a really big piece of it, and that's what the grantor is going to hold you to. So again, the goal here today is to do what you said you would do. All right, so let's talk about documentation. So how do we do what we said we would do, right? Well, we document. That's what we do, right? Paper, 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 okay? So here's why. And there's 5 of these. So, and we'll go through this quickly and then we'll talk about each one separately. So we want to manage the project effectively. We document so that we can evaluate, right? We also document so that we can disseminate the information to the community and to stakeholders, to people who care about the program, to our own organization. We also document so that we can provide guidance for replication. Clearly, things cannot be replicated if there's not paper trail to go with that. And finally, of course, most importantly for all of you, for continuation, right? Most of you know that your grant is going to run out at some point and you're either going to have to reapply for that particular grant or you're going to have to find a way to continue on your own. So clearly, these 5 reasons are very important to what it is that you're doing. And so how do we actually go about doing that? So manage the project effectively. If management of the project is to allocate resources to accomplish these activities, then we need to know, what are those resources, right? What are the activities, and what order, at what time, and what is needed to do them? So we're never going to remember all these things, right? When you first start something, oh, I remember what we did last Thursday, and it was at 2 o'clock, and we had 5 people here, and it was great. Well, now we're 6 months into the project, and somebody asks you, what happened at that meeting? And you can't remember, right? Because none of us has that kind of memory, even if we're really good at this. And for most of us, we're juggling so many things, it's much more difficult for us to remember all those. So the biggest reason for us is managing effectively is to have everything at our disposal. We don't want to waste time and energy looking or trying to remember. So we want all that stuff at our disposal so that we can easily get to it, right? So if somebody comes and asks a question, we can pull out the documentation and say, yes, this is what it was. We did this. Do we need to make a change to it? Well, I don't know. What did we do last time, right? So really the best thing for us to do is to document absolutely everything we possibly can. And that's going to help us to manage the project more effectively. The second reason is because evaluation is coming, right? Whether you're having a full formal evaluation or whether you're just turning in an evaluation report to the grantor at the end, they want to know about how you spent the money and they need you to be specific, right? And you cannot complete an evaluation of any sort if you don't have the data. And to be able to have the data, you have to document, right? They want to know specifically what you've done. They want to know that you did 25 community training sessions and there was a total of attendance of 8.5 adults at every one, and that was 36% of the population that you were trying to reach, okay? So they want to know that. They don't want to say, oh yeah, we did a good job. The community is really supportive of this. What do you mean by that, right? What do you mean? You mean you had 25 trainings and 8.5 people came on an average to each one, right? So if you document, you can only make that statement if you actually have done that documentation and you have those exact numbers and the tallies, right? So you just can't do an evaluation without it. And I see this so often in evaluations. People get to a point where they want to do an evaluation and I say, okay, well, what are your evaluation questions? And they come up with these great questions. This is what we want to check. We want to make sure we're doing this and this and this. And I say, okay, for that, you will need this kind of data or this kind of data. And they'll say, oh, we weren't collecting it. We haven't been documenting that. Well, you can't answer that question if you don't have the documentation, right? So it's a really big deal for us to make sure. So you always should be looking forward to say, what are the questions that they're going to ask me about this project, right? What was the goals? And of course, you can use tools like causal loops and logic models to help show you where you're going, and then make sure that you're actually documenting in the process of those kind of things. So the next thing is that we want to document to disseminate, right? What are you going to tell people? It's going to be your responsibility to get the word out, okay? So the grantor probably is going to have something to say about how they want to be identified with this project or program, and whether or not they want to say they are the grantor in this case, and if that's the responsibility and whatnot. But after that, it's really going to be up to you to get this information out, right? And of course, you're going to want to get the information out. What is this program about? What is this project doing? What do we expect out of it? And is it working? So there's going to be several times that you actually have to give out information. And again, you can't do that. You can't talk to the community about what your successes are or where you might need help later. If you want people to think that the community feels great about the project, you're probably going to have to do some interviews or some surveys. You're going to have to work with these people to see if they actually are really motivated about this or if it's just a thought, right? So you're going to have evidence for that. So documentation, definitely fundamental to dissemination. So next, we want to talk about documenting for replication. So a lot of grants are funded for a first-time project to try something, to see if it will work, like as a demonstration, maybe as a pilot program. And so at the heart of this is that the hope is always that we could use it, right? We want policies and programs and projects to be useful and used. And if we aren't really focusing on that, we aren't documenting to be able to replicate this, how is anybody going to be able to use that, right? It's your job to make sure that when you are providing this documentation that you understand there's a really good chance if it's working for you that maybe it will work someplace else in another community. Now there's two pieces to this. One, you want to make sure that you've documented well enough that they actually can replicate, right? I mean, some of you have maybe looked at other model programs and maybe they have perfect documentation, you understand exactly what they did, and other times you might have looked at this and thought, well, what happens here in the middle? There's no information about that. So clearly that's going to make it hard to replicate a program if you don't have that information. And the second thing is, some communities are not necessarily exactly the same. So the more information that you can document, they might be able to identify that, oh, maybe our demographics are off just a little bit. And so we need to not do this part or to do this part differently. But because you have actually done a good job documenting, they will know where they need to make adjustments to use your base model, but to maybe make some changes. So if you're looking at trying to replicate from someplace else, make sure that they actually have enough documentation. And when you're doing your program or project, make sure you're including as much as you possibly can, because there's a really good chance. Again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? If there are programs and projects that are out there that are working, we want to grab a hold of those and use what we can from that. And so I think it's really important for all of us, right? Public health is so broad, right? And we have from all the way at the federal level to the states, to the local level, and we're seeing such a disjuncture, right, between the levels. We can look to the current situation to be able to see that. But I think for a lot of us, we don't realize, each level has its own responsibility and they have their own ways of doing things. And so again, people sometimes get stuck on the let's start from scratch. And really there's a lot of things that are actually out there and are available for us to look at. And replication is really important for us to be able to do that, because all of us want to move forward and most of us are strapped for time, money, and things, right? So what we want to do is make the most of what we do have, and by replicating, we're able to actually do that. And the big one, of course, right? Continuation. So grantors make grants for lots of reasons, right? But if they've given you a grant to solve a problem, they're going to expect that solution will continue after the grant is over, right? They're not going to want you to solve the problem for the 6 months you have the grant or the 1 year you have the grant, and then all of a sudden the grant ends and that problem is back because there's no way to keep that moving, right? So sometimes we call this continuation, sometimes it's sustainability. It might actually become institutionalization if you can find a way to promote that into your organization that you already have. But really one important aspect of continuation is convincing other people to support that project, right? Again, you might be able to reapply for that same grant. You're gonna have to make your case for why you should continue. Sometimes you're gonna have to look to stakeholders or people outside in the community or to your board of directors or city or county governments, maybe the state health department or the federal government. And when you approach these groups with your request, you can't just give your heartfelt plea and say, please don't take this away, right? They want cold hard facts. And most of you know this, right? That data will get you a long way. I mean, let's think about it this way. If you can show that an investment of $10,000 in the project that you're doing will prevent $200,000 in future medical expenses, you're probably going to get some help with some funding for that, right? But you have to have that number, that data, that documentation. What have you done, and what do you see are the results for that? And again, that's our huge goal, right? Here is for continuation. We want whatever it is we're working on to be able to keep moving forward. It's very disheartening when we have to lose a program or project because the funding ran out, right? And so we really want to make sure that we use the best of our ability to get that documentation. And the more you can document, the better it's going to be for everybody. Okay, so now we know why we need to document, right? We have 5 reasons to document. So again, we want to document to be effective as managers, right? We want to document because we know that we're going to need to disseminate results. We want to document because we know we're going to need continuation. We know we're going to need evaluation, right? We know we have all these pieces for why we need to document. So that's the why. Okay, so if we know why, we want to know who documents, right? And so again, you have a documentation, you have this who documents in your package, but here's just, I mean, if we think about this, if we look at all these different places that could document, right? That's a lot. It's basically everyone. It's pretty much everybody who works in the project or program. This is not just you as a manager that's doing all the documentation. Of course, it's your job, again, to manage those things and make sure people are documenting what they should. But if we've assigned responsibility to someone, then we also need to make sure that they understand it's their job to document, right? That they need to understand the importance of documentation, because otherwise you're going to be stuck in that component when you go to ask them and they're not going to have it for you, right? So part of your thing is, you know, it'd be a good idea for those of you who are doing it, if there's other people working on your project or program, to think, okay, wait, am I asking them to document? Have I been clear about what I need from them at the end? Because we can't hold them responsible later if we haven't been clear in our expectations. So we have to think about that. Everybody documents. Excuse me. All right, so of course you could modify any of these things. Maybe you all don't have this. Some of you are laughing thinking, well, I don't have a financial office personnel, right? We have no project staff. We don't have volunteers or partners, right? So some of you will have to tweak some of this as you go through, but it's just a good, like I said, who do you have? Who's working with you and for you? Who's in your organization? Are you asking them to do the right part of documentation, right? Okay, so there's 3 different things that we're going to talk about as far as documentation during the grant process itself. Okay, so if we're going to talk, we need to do this, what are the things we're documenting? First of all, financial transactions, right? Of course, we all know this. That's that whole keep track of the money and how are we spending things. And we're going to spend all of our time in the third part talking about the financial transactions and how do we document. The other thing is events or encounters. And the last one, of course, is processes or components. Okay, so that seems basic and generic, so we'll talk a little bit about what each one of those are. Excuse me, my goodness. It's allergy season here in Southern California. For those of you, I guess I didn't mention that when I started. I'm coming to you live today from Southern California. An hour behind you, so I started nice and early, so there we go. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what each of these things are. So financial transactions. This seems relatively simple on the face of it, right? Because this category of financial transactions, this includes more than just cash, right? There's several different types of things that we consider as financial transactions. Cash is one of them. In-kind contributions.
This is Kim.
And project activities. Of course, salaries. Oops. All right, so if this is our list of things, right, we can think about it this way. You maybe have just cash transactions that take place as you spend the grant. Now, cash is hard because you've got to make sure you've got receipts and you've covered that. So typically we want to at least see that we're writing checks of some sort, which again, we'll mention later. There's in-kind contributions to the budget of the project by your organization. There are volunteers, there are partners. Maybe the organization as a whole is going to give you some cash for the project activities. Maybe you're going to generate some revenue with whatever it is you're doing for your program or project. And all of these financial transactions have to be documented. And again, in part 3, we're going to discuss how to actually break these things down so we know we're keeping really good track. But it's critical that you find out up front from the grantor, what are the requirements? right? You need to set up your system to comply with them. So they're going to have specific things that they want you to track and how you track them. So I'll give an example, and I'm going to use this several times today. So I am the treasurer for my son's high school basketball booster board, okay? Because I drew the short straw and nobody else wanted to do it. And you have to have a treasurer or you can't have a booster board. That's just the rules. So it's my job to keep track of the finances. Now I do that in a way that works for me, right? But at the end of the year, I have to turn that in to our overall parent booster organization. And they are very specific about what I have to turn into them and how to do it. So I have to check with them, right, to make sure that what I'm keeping track of will at least give me, I've documented everything in my way to be able to answer their questions at the end, right? And so if I'm not doing that, then I can't answer what they need me to answer when I get to that point. So it's really important for us. And again, I do it totally different than they do. I actually keep more information, and then that makes it easier for me. They want me to actually combine it. So it takes me quite a while at the end of the year to take those categories that seem very strange to me. And the reason it's like that is because every booster board is different, right? Because there are cheerleading and there is basketball and there's dance. Well, all of those things do, some of them create revenue and some of them don't, right? Some of them are just getting money. So what the overall board has tried to do is create a document that will be useful, that could be used by everybody. The problem is most of us don't keep track of things in that way because that's the way our booster board runs. And so I have to spend a lot of time. But again, the important part of that is that I need to know what they're going to ask me at the end, right? So you need to think about this. How is it that you're going to comply with those systems to be able to answer the financial transaction question? So next we have occurrences and events. These are things that are actually don't take place very often, right? Maybe once or twice throughout the course of your program or project, only a relatively short period of time. Might be things like a gala or an open house, a trip to DC, okay? So these are occurrences and events, the big thing that you do, you know, to get something off the ground or to promote what you've been doing for the last 6 months. This is the documentation that we need to keep track of for that. And when we do these things, we need to make sure that we don't just say we had an open house on Friday from 5:30 to 8:30, right? We want as much information as possible. If we've created a brochure, if we have a flyer, a pamphlet, if people are coming to this, do we take down their information to find out who was there? You know, we don't want to just know who said they might come, who actually showed up, who was really there for that kind of thing. So occurrences and events, that's a big one. We can go back and look to see. We haven't done it very often during the time, but it can give us some really useful information, especially when we're talking about getting money to continue our grants or to continue our program or project. We want to know the people who are actually involved, who shows up, who comes, who's helpful. And again, if we don't take down their information, we don't have any idea. And then it makes it really difficult, and we're spinning our wheels trying to figure out who came, who's involved, who actually means it, right? A lot of people in the community will say, oh, that's a great program, that's a great project. But when it comes to actually being involved with it, they're AWOL, right? So this is a way for us to document. And if we know that, then those are the people we can contact first, right? And hopefully then we can get them to help us get some other resources in the process of that. And finally, this piece, processes and components, okay? Processes and components are just the words that we use to talk about the project activities that take place probably through the duration of the project. These are the things that we think about all the time: mentoring, professional development, counseling, training participants, even documentation itself falls into this category, right? So in your handouts, you actually have a list of various financial transactions, occurrences, and components that have to be documented. And it's called Examples of What to Document. I think it looks like this. That's a lot. There's a lot of things right there, right? So this is the whole thing. This is financial transactions, occurrences, and components. Notice it looks like a jumbled mess. I did that on purpose, okay? I did that on purpose because I know when you start to think about all those things, there's a lot of them, right? And for some of you, you won't have all of them. But for most of it, you will look through here pretty quickly and see that you may have a lot of things that you actually need to be documenting, right? So here's the what. So again, hopefully you can pull this out and go, okay, I don't have to do any of those things. Oh, I probably need to document this, right? I don't know if we did that very well last time. And this is the best part, right? You know, nothing that we talk about in the training today is meant to say, oh, you're not doing that. You know, it's the whole point is for us to say, hey, I can make this change and it would be better, right? Because we're always looking to be better, and lifelong learning is a very good thing. So that's what we're doing on that. So now we've talked about why and we've talked about what. Let's talk about how. How do we document? Well, you're thinking, well, that's not hard. We just write stuff down, right? But for a lot of us, a lot of the events and encounters, those processes and components, and even the financial transactions, they automatically generate documents, right? So if you have payroll records or canceled checks, test results, publicity materials, training materials, questionnaires, all of those things, you've naturally created your own document. All you have to do is make sure you save it, right? I mean, have you ever sent out a questionnaire and somehow or another you lost the questionnaire along the way, right? Most of us have, thank goodness, cloud and that kind of thing. So it's a lot simpler for us to be able to keep up with that kind of process today. But it wasn't always that way, right? You know, if you misplace that questionnaire, who has it? Who remembers? Who made it? Who created it? And again, so you're going to want to keep a copy of all of those things that you're using and all those things that are being documented. And when you go to your people who are working with you, when you ask them monthly or quarterly for their documents, make sure that there's a copy of those things that you are keeping for yourself, right? Because, you know, we all know we have turnover, right? And so when that happens, we may lose whatever was documented from that particular person, or we don't know how or what they were documenting in the process. So if we can always collect that on a regular basis, and I think that's a big thing for us as managers, is don't wait till the end of the year, right? We want to make sure that we're doing these things on a regular basis. Are we checking in with our people and getting those documents and making the copies that we need to, so we can keep that file together? So a lot of times, like I said, all you have to do is gather the stuff. But sometimes, right, we actually have to create documents, right? So how do we do that? Well, you just have to think, what is the important concepts that we're actually doing, right? What are the creation of documents? How do we actually do this? Do we have to come up with this out of thin air? Maybe. Are there guidelines? Probably, right? Again, this is a really good way for you to just Google and go. Of course, there's always guidelines, and you can figure that out, that what goes into that. But think about this. Documents are any written or recorded material that provide a record of evidence about something that happened or the state that something is in. Okay, again, that's any written or recorded material. So sometimes we have to think outside the box. Maybe we need a video. Maybe we need to record part of the gala so that we can see, how did we set up the tables and how many people did we put there, and was it overcrowded? Did we do all those things? I mean, all that goes into the management of it. So it's not necessarily just writing, right? Well, maybe we need to take pictures. A lot of times, like I said, we need to think outside the box to make sure we're getting the best, what is the best way to document what we're talking about, right? So we just want to be able to provide that record or evidence about something that happened or the state that it was in. If we think about all the different things that we would know if we observed an occurrence, we can list the items. So what do we care about? So when you're creating your own document, right, part of the thing you need to do is think about, okay, what is important for us? And we want to be effective when we're doing that. We want to create a powerful, effective document, or again, video, pictures, things of that nature. But by effective, we mean something that preserves the essence of what happened. Did you capture that? Did you capture what happened at that time period, at that meeting, right? You know, you've seen meeting notes that, you know, you could not tell at all what happened in that meeting, right? And some meeting notes are 17 pages long and nobody ever reads them. But the reality is, if you need to look back, it's actually there. Think about it. In the long run, if you ever go back to meeting notes, if they've done a really good job, that's useful to you, right? It is just one little line on a bullet point. You have zero idea about what happened or what was covered. And if you've missed that meeting, you're at a loss, right? So there's a couple examples in your handout packets, and one is called the event documentation form, and the other is a people information form. So we're looking at it that way. Let me see. Event documentation form. Okay, so here it is. What was the reason for event? Where was it held? Who sponsored it? Who helped? How was it carried out? And the participants. Here's the information. Who was there, right? Specifically, how do we get a hold of them again? So when we need them to show back up, right, that we have that contact. Activities, what happened, right? And what were the outcomes? And again, all of these things can be tweaked. These are just simple Word documents, and I purposely left them like that. Most of these are taken from this book called Grant Winter's Toolkit, Project Management and Evaluation. It's an older text, but it's really user-friendly. It came actually originally, it has these documents within the text, but it came actually like on a floppy disk. So you can't get those anymore. So what I did was I replicated as much of that as I could for you, but I did leave them in Word documents purposely. So you can just copy paste. Hopefully you can just make these be useful for whatever you actually have to do. And the other one is the people information form, which looks like this. So who are they? Where do they live? How do we reach them? Do we need to know this ethnicity stuff? Does it matter what their gender is, right? Where is their employment? And what is their relationship to the project, right? Are they working for us? So this is a good thing to do, even for everybody you have. Do you have people information, right, on every bit of people that have anything to do with your project or program, right? Because if you don't, again, you're going to be at a loss at some point. And that's just more time that you're going to have to go looking through things. We don't want to say, well, how do we get a hold of so-and-so at the city commissioner, right? Well, if we have it here, if we've documented that. So even if you take time and give a responsibility, even if you haven't done an event or an open house, if you know the people that might be useful to what your overall goal is, go ahead and have people fill this stuff out so you've got that documentation later. So if you need to pull it, that you're not wasting time, you know. And we always have new people. We hope that we're adding to that as we move through it. But realistically, we want the more we can actually have a little file that says, here's all the people that might be helpful. That would be really great for us. All right, so let's jump back over here. Like I said, the event documentation form and the people information form, that's what we just looked at. So we've already gone through part 2. So here's a little recap, right? So what do we talk about? Documentation, super important, right? What are those 5 reasons to document? So to manage a project effectively, don't you love it when you're in a Zoom meeting and you're thinking, does she actually mean answer me? Right? So I was going to make Alexis and Emily do it, but we'll go with that. So they're not paying any attention at all, I can tell you right now. I'm just teasing, they are. But we want to manage the project effectively, right? We want to be able to, for evaluation, we want to do it for replication and for continuation, right? And so when we're looking at those pieces of it, that's the important part of why. What are the reasons we document? And what are the 3 categories of things that we document? Time, money, things, right? Time, money, and things. Okay, so those are our 3 categories of that. And who's going to document? Everybody. What are we documenting? Absolutely everything we possibly can, right? So knowing what to collect and how to do that is the most important piece